Good morning. How are you? It's Pop again, Dennis Murray. Today is Popcast 45, and it's part 6 of the evolution of the gift of each other. So we'll start with where we left off yesterday. Could there be a rudimentary form of our psychology that emerged in us 2 to 2.5 million years ago, and that led to the desire to associate intimacy with sex, so that pair bonding became, for the first time in the history of the world, uh, something that was practiced by a social species. And as we said earlier in 4 or 5 podcasts ago about this, there's no other species that lives in pair bonds in society. There are pair bonded species and there are social species, but there's none like us in our ancestor species. And this moment in history, 2 to 2.5 million years ago, is pretty wild. It's a major thing for dramatic new behavior to evolve in our ancestor species and continue to be the characterization that distinguishes us from the other animal species. So could there be such an emergence? That's a question that I need to show some reasonableness of. Of course, it can't be proven. Um, not only because it's an intuitive hypothesis on my part, but because the evidence of from those times and circumstances wouldn't allow for proof. But you can show whether or not it's possible and whether or not, what degree of reasonableness it might have. So yes, it's possible. The idea of emergence is a scientifically recognized idea. It is very controversial. Emergence is the word scientists use to describe how life began and how consciousness began, meaning how our intelligence began. And I take that back. I'm sorry. Meaning how human psychology began. Intelligence is, of course, part of it, but our psychology includes emotions and relations, a lot of parts of our being. And typically, scientists like to think in terms of our psychology arising from the complexity of our brain, as we said a couple of days ago. That's a big subject we're not going to get into until sometime later. But for our purposes, we speak of our psychology as arising from our brain. So it emerges when the brain becomes complicated enough for that to happen. And emergence in science is something is considered a property when a let me see if I can phrase this correctly. When a complex system produces effects that are not directly predictable from the subsystem. So, when you have a human brain and their pre-human ancestors' brain, and it suddenly starts doing things that other brains didn't do. And it's not just intelligence, it's psychology. It's now creating a psychology that's different from what had existed before in nature. Another way to look at it is psychology is a property that is a feature of the brain as a whole, but you couldn't point to any part of the brain and say, oh, there's where the psychology is. That loop added to the neurons is where psychology comes from. The functioning of the brain as a whole creates our psychology, and brains didn't used to do that. So there was the emergence of psychology in the brain by a process of evolution, and none of that is disputable. It seems that emergence is widely used in science, and it's applied to both the emergence of life from non-living organisms and also to the emergence of our psychology. Most scientists speak in terms of consciousness, but I like to use the word psychology because it refers to something we know more about, and something that's quite wide and includes all kinds of things: our feelings, our our instincts, our intuitions, etc., our habits and practices, our culture. It's all connected to this broad concept of our psychology, and I'm using psychology in this very, very broad way. So, yes, sometimes they speak of synergies that when the system, in the brain in this case, is the system in question. When the system grows and becomes more organized, then synergies arise, and so the brain gets capabilities that no part of it could have explained or predicted, and that's called emergence. Sometimes emergence occurs from unintended consequences or side effects of the way the brain grows. So you could have neural loops and other relationships between parts of the brain that seem to have this effect or that effect or this consequence or that consequence, but lo and behold, a side effect or an unintended consequence occurs and some property emerges. So it's, yes, the answer to today's question is yes, it's possible. A rudimentary form of our psychology could have emerged at that time. Emergence is an established notion. Our psychology did emerge at some point, and it didn't emerge full blown. There's no question but that it grew little piece by little piece. So, could it be that the desire for intimacy to be associated with sex emerged as a part of our psychology in this time period? Yes, it could. I can't prove that it did. And we have to look at subsequent behavior of humans then to see that this feature has persisted. That unlike any other species, this connection of, well, that's not true. Unlike any other species, there are some species where there seems to be, some pattern of, well, I'm going to skip that. So for humans, this desire to link intimacy and sex has persisted, and for quite a long time, and if anything, has become much stronger and much more socially supported. And so it definitely happened. It happened at some point. It may well have happened at this point, and it would be a better explanation, in my opinion, than the one that Deacon offers. So there is support for the evolution of the gift of each other having started at this time period and in this way, that people developed a desire to link intimacy and sex, and they began pair bonding, and they were already living in society, and that created a lot of difficulties that persist until now. Now, the scientific controversy, it's not so much about the existence of emergence, it's about how you phrase it and what inferences you draw from it. The argument is, in the hardest scientific terms, whether or not entropy is violated. If things develop more order from chaos. Does that violate the second law of thermodynamics? Believe me, I don't really understand that, and it's not part of our conversation today. I just wanted you to be aware that part of the scientific controversy involves this whole notion of entropy, and the answer that they're giving is that the brain is an open system. It extracts information and order out of the environment, so it doesn't violate the rules to have emerged. For psychology to have emerged from the brain doesn't violate the rules, but they were worried about that. The other aspect that worried them was religious aspects. Scientists want to have natural explanations for the things we observe in the world around us. And they're rather averse to any explanation that intimates that perhaps the real explanation is the existence of a divinity. They don't feel that that's science. So whether there are plenty of scientists who do believe in a divinity, but when doing science, they look for explanations that don't depend on the existence of a divinity. They keep science and religion separate. So there's always this big, background story whenever scientists talk. They want to be sure that their talk doesn't imply that there's some purpose to change, because then purpose opens the door to believers saying, well, that's divine purpose. And so that's all part of the controversy. And we'll have a further look at that, months from now, but not today. What you can look for, though, to further the reasonableness of an explanation that, for why the emergence occurred now instead of some other time, is for things in the circumstances of the humans at that time that might have created a pressure that needed this emergence to occur at this time. So then there's two kinds of, there's a mechanism called selection pressure, but there's another mechanism that's not so much a pressure as an experience. It's called dual phase evolution. So selection pressure. When times are tough, it might occasion adaptive changes in the species over time. So, when dramatic difficulties occur, populations that thrive do so by responding. And some of their responses are genetic or hereditary, including, as we talked about yesterday, the epigenetic, the behavioral, and the symbolic as a form of response. So selection pressure can bring responses. In this instance, though, it doesn't appear that selection pressure has a lot to do with it, because rather than being under the gun, they actually were getting the benefits of a hugely increased rich protein diet from the ability their brains gave them to use stone tools to butcher animals and to hunt in groups. And so that it really doesn't seem like that's a big part of this moment. But the other part, dual phase evolution, whenever people are in a circumstance where their situation is changing back and forth, the process of changing back and forth can itself facilitate evolution to occur. It can speed up the loop. It can speed up the process. It can be a trigger event. So what is the processes that were changing back and forth? So they were, on the one hand, living in pair bonds, and on the other hand, they are beginning to beginning to uh, associate intimacy with sex, and on the other hand, living socially. So they went back and forth between their intimate relations and their social relations, and going back and forth is one of these things that involves a dual phase. Dual phase just means that there's a circumstance that regularly changes back and forth from one thing to another. So, for example, typically, if there were other tribes in the area and they were dealing with, on the one hand, the relations between themselves and the other members of their tribe, and on the other hand, the relations between members of another tribe, that would be another dual phase. Um, it's not possible to tell the population that existed or the density of the population, the closeness of one tribe to another 2.5 million years ago, 2 million years ago. There's just no reliable evidence. Um, so you can't know if that particular cause contributed to the explanation for why pair bonding emerged with our psychology emerged and developed the desire for intimacy that led to the creation of pair bonding. Um, it is, however, the case that there were a growing number of members of the tribe, and that there was more protein. So the more protein means the brain is thriving, it's physically growing. Over time, the human brain size increased quite a bit, which had, contributed enormously to the complexity of the human psychology. I say human, I'm talking about our ancestor species 2 to 2.5 million years ago. And but that same uh, increase in protein meant there was an increase in tribe member numbers. The tribe became larger because there was more to eat, and of a particularly rich kind of food that contributed to the success of child raising and raising the children up to an age where they could begin to procreate. So, hence the tribe numbers grow. Now, at some point, tribes become too large and they split. But now we're back to the other side. If they're thriving so that they're splitting, then there's tribes in the neighborhood, and we're back to dual phase where you not only have to relate to your tribe members, but to members of another tribe. So there are a lot of things that can be pointed to as possible uh, aspects of the situation that may have brought out this emergence of the rudimentary form of human psychology at this time. And so it's a reasonable proposition to offer. There are some reasons in support of it. It can't be proven, but it's not just a BS. I'm not just a college freshman throwing out a bunch of clever sounding stuff. There's support for it, and there's enough support for it to be creditable for me to talk about it as if it were so. Bearing in mind, I try never to forget that because everything I'm saying is essentially uh, based on the intuition of awe, it's always possible that I could be wrong. Um, and I try not ever to forget that. So, okay, enough for today. Uh, Always enjoy trying to go through this process. It seems like it's good for me and it's a lot of fun. And I hope I've brought something to you. Take care. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.